The year is 1944. World War II has reached its most desperate phase. In the bombed-out ruins of European cities, Nazi Germany unleashes one of the most terrifying weapons ever mounted on tracks. A tank that doesn't fire shells, but rockets. This is the Sturmtiger, and its story is one of engineering madness, devastating power, and the desperate measures of a dying regime. The Sturmtiger, whose name translates to assault tiger, was unlike anything the world had seen before. Imagine a 65-ton monster, carrying a 380mm rocket launcher, a weapon so powerful it could demolish an entire building with a single shot. Today we're going to explore every aspect of this mechanical beast, its origins, its design, its combat record, and why it represents both the pinnacle and the madness of Nazi Germany's war machine. To understand why the Sturmtiger was created, we need to go back to 1943 and 1944. German forces were facing a new kind of warfare, urban combat. In cities like Stalingrad, Warsaw, and later in Germany itself, Wehrmacht troops found themselves fighting block by block, building by building. Traditional tank guns and artillery weren't effective enough against heavily fortified positions. The German military needed something that could destroy entire buildings, bunkers, and fortified positions. With minimal shots, they needed a mobile siege weapon that could accompany infantry into the heart of urban battlefields. Enter the Tiger 1-1 tank. By 1943, Germany was producing its famous Tiger fast heavy tank, a 57-ton behemoth armed with the legendary 88mm gun. However, Tigers were complex, expensive, and being lost at an alarming rate on the Eastern Front. Some damaged Tigers were being returned to factories for repair. German High Command made a decision. Instead of simply repairing these tanks, why not convert some into specialized assault vehicles? This was the birth of the Sturmtiger concept. But what weapon would this assault vehicle carry? The answer came from an unlikely source, the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy. Naval engineers had developed a 380mm rocket-propelled depth charge for anti-submarine warfare. This massive rocket, designated the Raketenwerfer 61, could deliver a crushing explosive payload. Someone in the Wehrmacht had an audacious idea. Mount this naval rocket launcher on a tank chassis. It was insane, it was desperate, and it just might work. In August 1943, the order was given to Alcott, the company responsible for producing assault guns for the Wehrmacht. They would take damaged Tiger I hulls and transform them into something entirely new. The project was designated Sturmmorserwagen 606 quarters MIT 38 centimeters RW 61, but everyone would come to know it simply as the Sturmtiger. Let's break down the specifications of this beast. The Sturmtiger retained the Tiger I's basic chassis and running gear, but everything else was completely redesigned. The main weapon was the 38 centimeters RW 61L/5.4, a breech-loading rocket launcher. This wasn't a traditional gun, it fired rocket-propelled projectiles. The barrel was just over 2 meters long and dominated the front of the vehicle. The caliber, 380mm, made it one of the largest weapons ever mounted on a fully tracked armored vehicle. The rockets themselves came in two types, the Raketen Sprenggranat 4581, a high-explosive rocket weighing 345 kilograms, and a shaped charge variant for penetrating fortifications. Each rocket could travel up to 6,000 meters, though practical combat range was much shorter, typically around 1,000 meters for accuracy. Loading this monster was an engineering challenge. The Sturmtiger could carry 14 rockets, one in the breech and 13 in storage racks inside the fighting compartment. But here's where it gets interesting. Each rocket weighed nearly 350 kilograms. Loading was done through a rear door and required a small crane that was built into the vehicle itself. The crew consisted of 7 men, a commander, driver, 2 gunners, 2 loaders, and a radio operator. Inside the cramped armoured box, these men worked in what can only be described as hellish conditions. Protection was substantial. The front superstructure was 150 mm thick, angled to provide even better protection. The sides were 80 mm thick. This made the Sturmtiger nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons of the period. The crew compartment was completely enclosed, with only small periscopes for vision. But all this armour and the massive weapon came at a cost: weight. The Sturmtiger weighed 65 tons, about 8 tons heavier than a standard Tiger F1. This put enormous strain on the drivetrain. Power came from the same Maybach HL230 P45 V12 engine used in the Tiger Vast, producing 700 horsepower. But pushing 65 tons meant the Sturmtiger was slow. Maximum road speed was only 40 kilometers per h, and cross-country speed was even worse. Fuel consumption was enormous. The Sturmtiger could travel only about 120 kilometers on a full tank of 540 liters. Now let's talk about what made the Sturmtiger truly terrifying: its ammunition. The standard high-explosive rocket, the Raketen Sprenggranat 4581, was a weapon of apocalyptic power. Packed with 125 kilograms of explosive, that's about 275 pounds, a single rocket could create a blast radius of devastating proportions. To put this in perspective, a standard 88 mm shell from a Tiger I carried about 1 kilogram of explosive. The Sturmtiger's rocket carried 125 times that amount in a single shot. When a Sturmtiger rocket hit a building, the results were catastrophic. The massive explosive charge would create a shock wave that could collapse multi-story structures. Concrete bunkers would be shattered. Underground positions would cave in from the overpressure. Witnesses described the explosion as unlike anything they'd experienced. A thunderous detonation followed by a cloud of dust and debris that would rise hundreds of feet into the air. The weapon wasn't designed for precision. It was designed for total destruction of area targets. One shot could clear an entire city block of enemy positions. The second type of ammunition was even more specialized: a shaped charge rocket designed to penetrate fortified positions. This version used the Monroe effect, a focused explosive jet that could punch through concrete and steel with terrifying efficiency. These shaped charge rockets could penetrate up to 2.5 meters of reinforced concrete. No bunker, no fortification from that era could withstand a direct hit from this weapon. It was overkill on a massive scale. But firing such a powerful weapon created its own problems. The muzzle blast was so intense that infantry couldn't operate anywhere near the Sturmtiger when it fired. The pressure wave alone could injure or kill anyone standing too close. The vehicle itself would rock back violently with each shot. And then there was the most bizarre problem: the rocket exhaust. Because these were rocket-propelled projectiles, firing created a massive backblast of hot gas and flames. Despite being inside an enclosed vehicle, the crew had to deal with toxic fumes and heat with each shot. A ventilation system was installed, but it was only partially effective. The rockets used a solid propellant that ignited when the round was fired electrically. This propellant would burn as the rocket traveled toward its target, giving it range and velocity. But the rocket didn't spin like a traditional artillery shell. It was stabilized by fins at the rear. This made accuracy somewhat unpredictable, especially at longer ranges. Production of the Sturmtiger began in August 1944 at the Alkut facility in Berlin-Spandau. But this wasn't mass production like the Sherman or T-34 tanks. The Sturmtiger was a specialized conversion, built in tiny numbers. From August 1944 to the end of the war, in May 1945, only 18 Sturmtigers were completed. Yes, you heard that right, just 18 vehicles. For all its power and engineering complexity, the Sturmtiger was produced in numbers so small it could barely affect the course of the war. Why so few? First, the base vehicle, the Tiger I, was itself produced in limited numbers, with only about 1,347 ever built. The Sturmtigers were converted from damaged or returned Tiger I hulls, so the supply of chassis was limited. Second, by 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Alkut factory itself was hit multiple times. Materials were scarce, skilled workers were being drafted into the Wehrmacht, and the entire German war economy was in collapse. Each Sturmtiger that was completed was slightly different. Early vehicles had different exhaust configurations. Some were fitted with Zemerit anti-magnetic paste to prevent magnetic mines from being attached. Others went into combat without this coating. The production vehicles showed variations in their tools, equipment, and even minor armor details. The vehicles were numbered and assigned to specialized assault companies. Sturmorsa Company 1000, 1001, and 1002 were the primary units equipped with these vehicles. Each company was supposed to receive multiple Sturmtigers, but chronic delivery problems meant units rarely operated at full strength. The first combat use of the Sturmtiger came during one of World War II's most tragic chapters, the Warsaw Uprising of August-October 1944. Polish resistance fighters, believing liberation by the Soviet army was imminent, rose up against German occupation. What followed was 63 days of brutal urban combat. The Germans, determined to crush the uprising, deployed everything they had, including at least one Sturmtiger. The Sturmtiger was used to demolish buildings where Polish fighters had established strongpoints. Historical accounts describe the terror these weapons inspired, the massive explosions, the complete destruction of entire structures, the inability of the resistance fighters to effectively fight back against such overwhelming firepower. It was psychological warfare as much as it was military operation. One account describes a Sturmtiger firing into a fortified apartment building. The rocket penetrated the facade and detonated inside. The entire building collapsed, killing dozens of resistance fighters. The shockwaves shattered windows hundreds of meters away. But the Sturmtiger wasn't invincible. Operating in tight urban environments, these massive vehicles were vulnerable. One Sturmtiger was disabled by Polish fighters who managed to attack it with explosives. The narrow streets of Warsaw were difficult to navigate for a 65-ton vehicle, limiting its effectiveness. Despite the Sturmtiger's firepower, the Warsaw Uprising was ultimately crushed through conventional means: artillery, airstrikes, and infantry assaults. The Sturmtiger was a terror weapon, but it didn't change the outcome. By October 1944, Warsaw was in ruins and the uprising was over. The experience in Warsaw demonstrated both the power and the limitations of the Sturmtiger. It could destroy almost anything it hit, but it was slow, vulnerable in close quarters, and consumed ammunition at an alarming rate. As the Allies closed in on Germany from all sides in early 1945, Sturmtigers were deployed on the Western Front. Sturmtiger Company 1001 was sent to face American forces pushing into western Germany. The combat debut against the Americans came near Reichswald Forest in February 1945 during Operation Veritable, the Allied push to reach the Rhine River. The Sturmtigers were used in a defensive role, firing at Allied concentrations and fortified positions that had been captured from the Germans. American troops reported encounters with an unusual German weapon that fired massive projectiles. Intelligence officers were initially confused. Was this some new type of super-heavy mortar? The first clear identification came when a disabled Sturmtiger was captured intact. One recorded engagement involved a Sturmtiger firing at an American command post established in a reinforced building. The rocket struck the structure's upper floor, and the entire building collapsed. The explosion was so powerful that American troops nearly 300 meters away were knocked down by the blast wave. But by March 1945, the Sturmtigers on the Western Front were in dire straits. Fuel shortages meant they often couldn't move. Ammunition supply was nearly non-existent. The specialized 380 mm rockets were only produced in small quantities, and with Germany's industrial infrastructure collapsing, new ammunition couldn't reach the front lines. Several Sturmtigers were abandoned by their crews when they ran out of fuel or ammunition. Others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. A few were captured intact by advancing American forces, who were astounded by what they found. During the fighting around the Remagen Bridge, the intact Rhine crossing, captured by the Americans in March 1945, at least one Sturmtiger was reportedly positioned to fire at the bridge. Whether it actually did fire and with what effect remains unclear from historical records. What is clear is that it failed to destroy the bridge, and American forces consolidated their hold on the west bank of the Rhine. By April 1945, most Sturmtigers on the Western Front had been lost. They ended their combat career not with a bang but with a whimper. Abandoned hulks on the roadside, out of fuel and ammunition, symbols of Germany's lost war. On the Eastern Front, Sturmtigers faced their ultimate test during the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. As Soviet forces closed in on Hitler's capital, every available weapon was thrown into the desperate defense. Sturmmoser Company 1000, equipped with several Sturmtigers, was deployed in the defense of Berlin. These vehicles were tasked with destroying Soviet strongpoints, thus breaking up armored attacks and generally causing maximum destruction to the advancing Red Army. The urban environment of Berlin should have been ideal for the Sturmtiger. Narrow streets, heavy buildings, short engagement ranges. But by April 1945, Berlin was already a ruin. Months of Allied bombing had destroyed much of the city's infrastructure. Streets were blocked with rubble. Many buildings were already collapsed. One account describes a Sturmtiger firing at a column of Soviet T-34 tanks advancing down a Berlin boulevard. The rocket hit between two tanks, and the explosion destroyed both vehicles and killed the infantry following them. The blast crater was several meters across, and the shockwave shattered windows in buildings on both sides of the street. But the Sturmtigers in Berlin faced the same problems as everywhere else: chronic shortages of ammunition and fuel. Soviet forces also learned to target these massive vehicles with everything they had: artillery, tanks, anti-tank guns, and even ground attack aircraft. Several Sturmtigers were knocked out by Soviet heavy tanks like the IS-2, whose 122 mm gun could penetrate even the Sturmtiger's thick armor at close range. Others were disabled by near misses from artillery that damaged their tracks or running gear. As Berlin fell, the remaining Sturmtigers were either destroyed by their crews or captured by Soviet forces. The Red Army was fascinated by these strange vehicles and transported several back to the Soviet Union for evaluation. For all its impressive firepower, the Sturmtiger was plagued by serious technical problems. Many of these stemmed from its Tiger I origins. The Tiger I was already a mechanically complex and unreliable vehicle. Adding an extra 8 tons of weight made everything worse. The transmission and final drives were constant sources of trouble. These components, already stressed in the standard Tiger I, were pushed beyond their design limits in the Sturmtiger. Breakdowns were common and repairs required specialized tools and skilled mechanics, both of which were in short supply by 1944 to 45. The engine overheated regularly, especially during slow urban operations where the cooling system couldn't work efficiently. Fuel consumption was astronomical. A Sturmtiger might burn through its entire fuel supply in just a few hours of combat operations. The tracks and suspension suffered terribly under the vehicle's weight. Track links would break, road wheels would fail, and torsion bars would snap. Replacing a broken track in combat conditions could take hours, leaving the vehicle vulnerable. Then there were problems unique to the Sturmtiger's weapon system. The electrical firing mechanism was temperamental. Moisture could cause misfires. The loading crane was delicate and prone to jamming. The ventilation system meant to clear toxic rocket exhaust fumes from the crew compartment was inadequate. Crews regularly suffered from smoke inhalation and heat exhaustion. The rockets themselves had quality control issues. Late-war German manufacturing standards had collapsed, and ammunition produced in 1945 was notoriously unreliable. Rockets sometimes failed to ignite or ignited prematurely or flew off target. At least one Sturmtiger was lost when a rocket exploded in the barrel during firing. Accuracy was another major problem. The 380 mm rockets were fin-stabilized, not spin-stabilized like traditional artillery shells. This made them susceptible to wind and atmospheric conditions. At ranges beyond 500, 600 meters, hitting a specific target was more luck than skill. The crew conditions inside were hellish. 7 men crammed into a confined, poorly ventilated space, handling 350-kilogram rockets, dealing with heat and toxic fumes, all while under enemy fire. Crew fatigue was a constant problem, and trained Sturmtiger crews were almost impossible to replace when lost. German tactical doctrine for the Sturmtiger was developed hastily and was never really perfected before the war ended. The official role was as a heavy assault vehicle for destroying fortified positions in urban or heavily built-up terrain. In theory, Sturmtigers were supposed to operate in small groups, supported by infantry and conventional tanks. The infantry would identify targets, bunkers, fortified buildings, strong points. The Sturmtiger would then position itself at a safe distance and engage with its massive rockets. In practice, it rarely worked out this way. By late 1944 and early 1945, German forces were on the defensive everywhere. Coordinated, combined arms operations became increasingly difficult to execute. Sturmtigers often operated alone or in pairs without adequate support. The weapon's limitations shaped its use. The low rate of fire, only 1 shot every 5-10 minutes under ideal conditions, meant that Sturmtigers couldn't engage multiple targets quickly. The limited ammunition load of 14 rounds meant that an entire day's combat might exhaust the vehicle's ammunition supply. Range was another limiting factor. While the rockets could theoretically reach 6,000 meters, practical combat range was much shorter. Most engagements took place at 500, 1,000 meters. At these ranges, the massive explosion of the warhead made precise aiming less critical. Close was often good enough. The psychological impact of the weapon was significant. The sight of a Sturmtiger, the thunderous report of its firing, and the devastating explosion of its rockets had a profound effect on enemy morale. Allied troops who encountered these vehicles often reported them as something terrifying and alien. But psychological warfare couldn't compensate for the Sturmtiger's fundamental flaws. It was too slow, too unreliable, too limited in ammunition, and too vulnerable to be truly effective as a combat vehicle. It was a weapon born of desperation, deployed in desperation, and ultimately failing in desperation. To truly understand the Sturmtiger, we need to compare it with other assault guns and self-propelled artillery of World War II. How did it stack up against its contemporaries and equivalents? Germany produced several other heavy assault vehicles. The Sturmpanzer IV Brummbau carried a 150 mm howitzer. The Ferdinand Sasch Elephant tank destroyer mounted an 88 mm gun in a heavy casemate, but none approached the raw destructive power of the Sturmtiger's 380 mm rocket launcher. The Soviet Union, famous for its heavy artillery, never produced anything quite like the Sturmtiger. The closest equivalent was the ISU-152 assault gun, mounting a 152 mm gun howitzer. While effective, its firepower was nowhere near the Sturmtiger's level. The United States developed the T-95 super heavy tank and various heavy self-propelled guns, but again nothing matched the sheer explosive payload of the Sturmtiger's rockets. The British, always practical, never attempted anything similar. Their doctrine favoured conventional artillery and specialised demolition charges over massive, self-propelled rocket launchers. In terms of pure destructive power per shot, the Sturmtiger was unmatched. No other armoured vehicle in World War II could deliver such a massive, explosive charge onto a target, but in every other metric, reliability, operational range, ammunition supply, rate of fire, cost-effectiveness, the Sturmtiger was inferior to conventional assault guns. The Sturmpanzer IV, for example, fired 150 mm shells that were readily available, could carry more ammunition, was more reliable, and was produced in larger numbers. The Studge, the III assault gun, Germany's most numerous armoured fighting vehicle, was infinitely more practical and arguably more effective in actual combat. The Sturmtiger represents the endpoint of a certain philosophy of weapons design, that overwhelming firepower could compensate for all other deficiencies. History proved this philosophy wrong. Effectiveness in war comes from combined arms, logistics, reliability, and numbers, not just raw destructive power. The American technical intelligence teams were fascinated by the Sturmtiger. They had never seen anything quite like it. Engineers and weapons specialists examined every aspect of the design, from the rocket launcher mechanism to the armor layout to the internal ammunition storage. One captured Sturmtiger was extensively photographed and documented at the Allied tank testing grounds. Engineers test-fired captured ammunition to understand the weapon's capabilities. The reports they filed expressed a mixture of awe at the weapon's power and disbelief at its impracticality. The Soviet-captured vehicles were transported back to proving grounds in the USSR, where they underwent similar evaluation. Soviet engineers were particularly interested in the rocket launcher technology and the armor protection scheme. Most captured Sturmtigers were eventually scrapped. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, with the Cold War underway, these vehicles were seen as curiosities rather than serious military hardware. The rocket launcher technology was outdated compared to the guided missiles being developed. However, a few Sturmtigers survived and exist in museums today. The most famous is the vehicle at the Deutsches Panzermuseum in Münster, Germany. This Sturmtiger is in relatively complete condition and is one of the most popular exhibits in the museum. Another Sturmtiger resides at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, Russia. This vehicle was captured by Soviet forces and has been preserved as an example of late-war German armour development. The Musée des Blancs in Saumur, France, also has Sturmtiger components on display, though not a complete vehicle. These museum pieces are all that remain of the 18 Sturmtigers that were built. They stand as monuments to a particular moment in military history, when Germany, facing inevitable defeat, threw every desperate idea into combat, hoping something might turn the tide. So what is the legacy of the Sturmtiger? What does this strange, powerful, impractical vehicle tell us about World War II and about weapons development? First, the Sturmtiger represents the desperation of Nazi Germany in the final years of the war. It was a weapon born not from rational military planning, but from the frantic attempts to find something, anything, that might stop the Allied advance. The fact that only 18 were built tells you everything you need to know about Germany's industrial collapse by 1944 to 45. Second, it demonstrates the danger of prioritizing firepower over all other considerations. Yes, the Sturmtiger could destroy anything it hit, but it was slow, unreliable, expensive, difficult to supply, and consumed resources that could have been better used elsewhere. Military effectiveness isn't just about killing power, it's about logistics, reliability, and sustainability. Third, the Sturmtiger shows the limits of technological innovation without strategic vision. Germany produced many wonder weapons in the final years of the war: jet fighters, ballistic missiles, super-heavy tanks, and weapons like the Sturmtiger. None of them could change the fact that Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and strategically defeated. The Sturmtiger also had almost no influence on post-war weapons development. The technology of mounting a large-caliber rocket launcher on a tank chassis was not pursued by any major military after 1945. The future of infantry support and bunker busting lay in guided missiles, recoilless rifles, and precision-guided munitions, not massive, unwieldy rocket tanks. Today, the Sturmtiger is remembered as one of the most unusual armoured vehicles of World War II. It appears in documentaries, books, model kits, and video games. Its distinctive, brutal appearance and massive firepower have made it a favourite subject for military history enthusiasts. But we should remember the Sturmtiger in its proper context. As a desperate weapon from a desperate regime, fighting a war it had already lost. Its power was undeniable, but its impact was negligible. It changed nothing, it saved nothing. It was ultimately a curiosity, a terrifying, fascinating curiosity. We've journeyed through the complete story of the Sturmtiger from its origins in the urban warfare nightmares of 1943, through its hasty design and limited production, to its desperate deployment in the final months of World War II, and finally to its place in history as one of the most unusual armoured vehicles ever created. The Sturmtiger was a tank that fired rockets. It could destroy buildings with a single shot. It terrified those who faced it. But it couldn't change the course of history. By the time it entered service, Germany's fate was already sealed. Today, only a handful of these vehicles survive in museums. Silent witnesses to a particular moment in military history, when engineering ambition, tactical desperation, and industrial collapse combined to produce something that was simultaneously impressive and futile. The Sturmtiger stands as a reminder that in warfare, Overwhelming firepower is not enough. Logistics, reliability, numbers, and strategy matter more than any single weapon system, no matter how powerful. This has been the story of the Sturmtiger, the tank that fired rockets, and the insane destructive power it represented.